Hello, hello. Hi, everyone. Very nice to meet you. I'm delighted to be the moderator for today's panel. We have a rockstar group of global CISOs coming to talk to us about cross-border threats, risks, and dynamics that we should be focused on the global stage. I'd love to first introduce Tim Ehrhart from Roche. Tim is very unique. He is one of the few security leaders that hacked his way into his job early on in his career. And as part of that, that led to his movement from Germany to Zurich today. I'd love to introduce Dimitri next from Dutch Railways. Fun fact about Dimitri, he got married in Tibet. And so he is our Zen master for today, and he's going to help us understand how to calmly and rationally talk to executives. Next, I'd love to introduce Alex Levinson. He is the CISO at Scale AI. His fun fact is he's been on the road for over 200 days this year, living globally on the plane and in a hotel. And lastly, and not least, I'd love to introduce Priya from Sheridan College. Her fun fact is she has worked in over 6 countries, including many countries based in Asia and in North America. All righty. Welcome, welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to begin this panel. I'd love to start our very first question with Priya. You know, we're talking about risk. We're talking about threats. We're talking about how do we think about multinational, global sort of perspectives with regards to the CISO perspective. Currently, you're based in Canada, but you've worked in the US, you've worked in Asia, and you've also done it for multiple clients all across the world as well. What has changed in your perspective in terms of global threats over the last couple of years?
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate the question, Will. First of all, thrilled to be here talking about this exciting topic. So I think the first thing is I'll take a step back and say cybersecurity has really evolved, right, in the way that the threat actors have evolved their game, watching what's happening around them as well. So if you look at cyber incidents, I don't know, 10 years ago, they were focused on isolated incidents, focusing on particular organizations. Right? Now it has moved to cybersecurity really being a strategic field that you can use for competitive advantage or to be used to benefit you from a political gain perspective. So keeping that in mind, the threat actors' games too have evolved, or exploits too have evolved. So you know, thinking about 3 ways in which I've seen the change is, number one is around weaponization of supply chains and critical infrastructure, especially because everyone here is a Microsoft shop or similar to other companies, right? Like we use vendors that are headquartered in other in other countries in the world. Along with that, we also see a lot of attacks, like I said, is really around focusing on attacks around critical infrastructure. That means utilities, that means telecom, that means OT, right? So we've really looked at those being attacked as well because the motive has really changed from, again, like I said, isolated attacks to causing more systemic risk where economies can be crippled at scale. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. The second thing is AI, sure. I cannot not talk about AI, right? So, you know, AI accelerated influence and AI accelerated security operations or other type of operations as well. The reason I say that is that with respect to the number of disinformation and misinformation campaigns and deepfake and social engineering scams, it has really eroded our digital trust and turned that around on its head to become a geopolitical battlefield. As a result of that, cyber defenders really need to focus on, we need to rethink our strategies on identity, on verification, and on incident response. So those are 2 things that come to mind. The third thing that comes to mind is really the blurring of lines between nation-state attacks, nation-state actors, and criminal ecosystems. So if you were to dissect some of the ransomware related incidents over the past year, over 50% of them are attributed to nation-state actors, when what we hear is that it's related to a lapsus or a scattered spider. So what that means is that, nation-states are sponsoring or kind of using criminal proxies to act on their behalf to achieve geopolitical objectives. So that's my take on it. Again, not a doom and gloom, but we just need to change the way we defend in our world.
I love that. There's so many great thoughts in there. I mean, when we talk about even thinking about attribution across borders, it seems to me something so difficult to do. Like, how do you actually know who did what? And then also, how important is it? Like, is this actually a critical fact that people want to know? I mean, Tim, I'd love to ask for your perspective here. You've hacked your way across borders.
Yeah, I think we have this tendency in the cybersecurity field, like, we want to know who did everything, which is natural. Like, we want to know who's behind it because we want to know what are their capabilities. And at a macro level, if you know what group you're dealing with, that's helpful. Because if you're dealing with web defacement, you're not worried, right? You're not probably that concerned. If you've got a ransomware actor who wants to take down your company, you have a very different threat. So the way you respond is going to be there. But actually, just as Priya was saying, so much has been blurred. So even if you're just looking at what seems to be some commercial attack, someone who might be stealing money from you or something like that, it really might just be a proxy. And in fact, if we see a lot of the traditional attacks, some basic piece of malware on a laptop, we look at that traditionally as, okay, we clean it up, we move on, because if you're a large enterprise, you can't stop to think about it too much. But we also, in the era of initial access brokers, have to think that that one compromise could lead to something far, far bigger because people are buying that access. So I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but you kind of have to look at it as any breach of your system has to be treated seriously and dealt with quickly, because you really don't know if it's going to just be a one-off, or even if it was a one-off, if someone's going to buy it and try and do something much worse.
I'd love to sort of think a little bit about sort of these bad actors in the form of, who's actually doing what, right? And for me, one of the things that shocked me as we sort of investigate and look back towards different breaches is how one nation's impact can spill over into a completely other country. And for that, I'd love to ask Dimitri to talk a little bit about that experience as well. In your experience, have you had experiences where you could actually attribute a cybersecurity incident due to another country or another organization's issues?
Well, I think it's very important for you to understand that the railway company, we exist for 200 years already. So it started in England 200 years ago. In the Netherlands, we are driving
and
trains.
Dimitri, I apologize. Would you mind pushing? Yes. Thank you.
Is that better?
Much better, yeah.
So almost 200 years of operations in railway infrastructure. And that means that you have a lot of OT, you have a lot of IT, and nowadays we have a lot of AI. Now, when I joined Dutch Railways 4.5 years ago, it was about half a year before the war started in the Ukraine. And the Russians, they were actually moving tanks via Belarus to the Ukraine. Now, the first target was the Belarusian railways. And for that, they created a lot of malware, also aimed at the OT environment, at the signaling systems, at the whole ecosystem of railway. And you should really understand that in the whole world, there's only a dozen of railway providers, of equipment providers. The big train builders, the big signaling builders, there's only a handful of them. So that malware can be reused. So what we needed to do is to scale up, to ramp up, and to make sure that we were resilient to that kind of malware, like Indestroyer 2 you had, and you had all those Swiss pocket knives full of solutions to breach railway operations. So yeah, that was kind of a shocking experience for railway in general, because up until then, we were a bit out of the woods, and all of a sudden, we were primary target because we were not part of the war, but the malware was being reused by commercial,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, it ties really nicely back to Priya's point about OT, right? How cross-border is actually impacting the physical world, and then now it's impacting infrastructure. For infrastructure, I'd really love to ask Alex. You've been on the road, you've been to so many different countries just this year, for example. Have you seen any examples of resilience or infrastructure change because of the geopolitical cyber issues that we're seeing today?
Yeah, I think the world exists on an international scale. We talk about the vertical integration of a lot of these threat actors having, it's become blurry because now we have whole economies of initial access brokerage, we have whole economies around ransomware, just making the software of it. The entire supply chain of the criminal ecosystem that we see is leveraged by anybody with access to that market. So by understanding that market, you can really understand sort of where the world is in that. And I think that, this region, the Middle East, is actually a prime example of how to look at what resiliency really needs to mean. So for example, I think telecoms, we used to just assume that all telecoms across the world were secure. But I think what we've seen with mobile attacks and whether it's the targeting of journalists, or whether it's the targeting for nation state purposes for espionage, the underlying initial access brokerage of that is actually of backdoors and compromises of the telcos. So then it's incumbent upon telecoms, both nationally and then regionally, to make sure that they have resiliency before you can actually start to go and try and say, how do I do business in this region? So I actually think of it from a quasi-OSI of like, if I'm gonna go and try and do business in a region, what is the resiliency of the critical infrastructure of that region? Because if that is weak, I'm going to struggle to do business and be resilient against the threats to my business.
When you talk about telecom, right, it's a service that we all depend on, and it's something that we don't always think about as well. It really makes me think a little bit around sort of like third-party risk. I mean, I'd just love to poll the audience really quickly. How many of you have had an incident related to third party this year?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Universally, right? How many of you had a third-party incident that was global, from a global third party?
Say that one more time.
How many of you had an issue related to a global third party?
Yeah.
A third party outside of your country?
Yes.
Like 100%?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so now we have to think about the globalization nature of it. Now we have to think about when these incidents happen, which happened to almost everyone in the industry multiple times this year over the last 12 months. How do you talk about that with your executives? How do you talk about that with your board? I'd love to go to you, Tim.
Yeah, so I think with, we also have the other problem is we are global. So my organization is truly global, literally almost every country of the world. And so the risks we have, you asked the question if our third-party risk came from something cross-border. Well, everything's cross-border, and you're in every country of the world. You've got something happening. One of the things we think about when it comes to global risk is if you're in every country, there are also some benefits, and there's some risks there. But it changes a little bit about how you think what your risk profile is. If you're in a single country, you kind of look at things at the outside. As you asked, does the risk come from your country or somewhere else? If you're a global company, you really have to address it globally. And there is no us versus them, particularly if you're in an area that supports the whole world, like healthcare. And so it's not us or them, it is the whole world is just as risky. And so we look at it a little differently than you might look at it in a single country, because we have to say, we have roughly the same risk in every country. We have people in almost every country of the world. We have manufacturing facilities in almost every country of the world. So some of the things you might normally say of, hey, we don't want our employees to travel to a certain place, or we don't want to do business in a certain place, that just doesn't apply. You have to accept the risk of having tens of thousands of people in every major market of the world. So you look at it a little differently, and I think it's not that you certainly don't ignore the risks, but you have to look at it through a lens it's not there's a safe country and a dangerous country. The whole world is a dangerous place, and you've got to look at it that way.
So so we have sort of the perspective, how do we educate internally our executives? I really would love to ask Priya for her perspective here, right? Because you've spent so many years consulting and advising Fortune 500 companies as well. How do you advise them or think about global risk from a from an advisory consultative perspective?
Sure, well, yeah. So I'll say, so the first thing is I'll point to a statistic, and I know we chatted about this earlier. So based off of Verizon's 2025 data breach investigations report, over 30% of cyber breaches just from the last year were attributed to third parties. In my humble opinion, I think it's a little underestimated, understated.
We sort of solve 100% here, but.
Yeah, so that's just the stark statistic, right? That's just gaping at you. So how I kind of, manage that from an executive communication and board reporting perspective is to, put things in perspective from an external perspective, but also relating it to some of the incidents we recently had, right? Like CrowdStrike, right? Like we all had the outage situation last July 19, 2024. And I'll tell you that it was internal, right? Like we use CrowdStrike. So, being able to pull from that and saying, do we want to have this kind of, operational disruption and impact to our institution? And how do we diversify and make sure that not all our eggs in one basket goes a long way, right? Just pointing to your internal examples as well. The third part I use is, again, the regulations, right? In Canada, we actually have, this is more for the financial services sector, but I think it's applicable across industries. In the financial services sector, there's OSFI, that's a supervisory body, and they have a third-party risk management standard, and the two themes that come across there are around how you manage concentration risk with respect to how concentrated you are with one third party, right? So really making sure you have redundancy, the contagion risk related to that. And the second part is to make sure if you have a cloud provider, how do you make sure it's easy enough for you to, allow your organization to be able to port it to another cloud platform. Let's say if one of the cloud platforms were to go down. Right? I know we're talking about a doomsday scenario, but those are some of the things I use, and so as a result of which, some of the focus areas based off these communication is really around doubling down on understanding what your critical third parties are for your organization, and also your critical fourth parties, because we all know about the SolarWinds hack, right, of a few years ago. So it's to focus on that and the critical fourth parties, and be able to make sure you have your due diligence, your periodic assessments, and have tight and clear escalation protocols and breach notification procedures.
I always love, for me, I feel like my heart was, I was formerly a consultant because I love frameworks, I love statistics. So thank you, Priya, for providing a statistic for the group. I think one of the things I think a lot about is, there have been all these outages. And so it makes me think a lot about resilience on a global scale, as well as what does a global company do in that scenario? Alex, I'd love to ask you about that.
I'm probably the anti-Priya here, and I'm ashamed to say it because you have like such a swath of expertise there, but in living it every day, for me, how do we combat this threat is very tactical. Like we can do all the planning, we can do all the risk management, I can go talk to the board, but at the end of the day, if me as the CISO and my team as security is not on the ground doing our job, all that planning is really was for naught. So what actually works, what actually do we do to implement these controls and try and at least bend the tide and change sort of the calculus at play? The first thing I would say, I treat counterintelligence as a first-class citizen within my security program. That's not something I think a lot of CISOs would say up front. That's not what I think a lot of security programs, as you walk around and look at vendors. I don't know that there's very many vendors here that say we specialize in counterintelligence. Running a counterintelligence unit inside of your organization, in my mind, is critical, because if we can know what our threats are, we can actively be detecting and disrupting them. That to us helps us stay ahead of that. In part of that really comes down to understanding our threats. Now, when I say threat intelligence, that doesn't mean that I'm buying a threat feed of malicious IPs. It means putting my people who are frontline engineers into communities, into conferences, into joining discords that might just be college kids hacking. Getting on the front lines of what we see as that entire ecosystem, the more we can meet and get awareness of what's happening in that sort of, we'll call it the underworld of cybercrime, it's critical for our understanding of knowing how that works so that we can stay out in front of it. I can tell you we have made decisions around technical controls in our organization, not because we got some report from CISA, but because we saw some stuff in a Discord that was like, this is literally what they're doing now. This is the direction they're heading. We can make sure we can mitigate that threat before it comes back around in a few months, because that's what all the ransomware gangs will be doing.
You know, I think it's so interesting to know that there's still so much valuable information out there in the world. Like you think about the internet, you think about all the noise, and how do you find that signal from that noise as well? And I love to hear that. I mean, for me, I would love to double click on this and think about it just from a global perspective, right? I mean, Scale obviously has global offices, but it's like a Bay Area AI company, right? I'm really curious by Dutch Railways, right? Infrastructure, railroad. I mean, how do you stay ahead of the threat actors and get a sense of what's coming towards you?
Yeah, so Priya mentioned the CrowdStrike event that happened. Now you should be aware that Dutch Railways is one of the most dense railway in the world, one of the most accurate. I think we're next to Switzerland and Japan. So top 3 in the world. When CrowdStrike happened, we were able to call or send a signal app to our 30 most important providers in the supply chain that were running our critical processes. Within half an hour, we were aware of who was running CrowdStrike, who wasn't, and we could inform the ministry about our, estimate, will we be able to drive trains? Because the airlines were already going down, and that had a global effect. Now, we don't have a global railway system, so locally we were okay. So we survived the CrowdStrike attack, and we were able to proactively engage with the supply chain. Now, that's something we can do as from this year, or actually medio last year. We started building that capability because of a very big breach we had 3.5 years ago. One of the biggest breaches in the Netherlands wasn't caused by ourselves, it was caused by a provider of our provider. So you're talking about third-party risk management. I'm talking about fourth-party risk management. And that's a big concern, actually, and it's very difficult to manage as well. What we did after that big breach, because we had to notify around 800,000 travelers that their data was being sold on the dark web. So after that incident, although it wasn't our fault, we set up a cybersecurity supply chain risk management team. It's a mouthful. It's now 6 people, and they are engaging with the supply chain. First off, when we contract new suppliers, there's proper cybersecurity paragraphs in there, AI paragraphs, and boundaries and regulation. Next, we are engaging with the running contracts and seeing if they adhere to ISO standards, the 27001 or SOC 2 Type 2. If you don't have it, you're out. You're not delivering anymore. So that's also some kind of a hygiene factor that is now very prominent. And also there's a European regulation, the NIS2 regulation, that also is making it mandatory for end users to control the supply chain. So we had a breach, which you could say that is a inherent motivation to do stuff, and there's also legislation which forces the supply chain to step up. But I find it very difficult to say that we've accomplished to secure the supply chain. I think it's one of the biggest gaps that we have in our ecosystem.
I mean, I'm thinking a little bit about spillover, right? Third party, fourth party risk, right?
Fifth party.
Yeah, and fifth party, and it keeps going on and on and on, right? And then we talk about the things that are sort of outside of our control in terms of threat actors, in terms of attribution, in terms of research.
And global shifts of ownership of companies.
Right.
Because we were dealing with a local company, and then it was bought by a Canadian company, and then it was bought by a US company. So it's all also different jurisdictions that you're moving in. So it's a very complex world now.
You know, I think one of the things I'm curious around is like, how do we predict the spillover of all this, right? How do we communicate that, right? And say, hey, this risk is real. It could happen to us. I think it is a high, medium, low, 20%, 50%, component to that. I think a lot about how do we get people, set the right expectations with our executives. I mean, I'm really curious, Tim, what do you do here?
So I think one interesting piece is we're not communicating that risk is kind of in two pieces. One, the technical risk doesn't change in geopolitics, I think, for at least for a truly global company, because you're literally everywhere. We're all interconnected, so I don't look at it that way. We see a lot more risks in the political and the legal landscape because, I mean, if you look at the simplest framework of as geopolitics shift, we build things like GDPR. We're building laws that say, hey, we want data residency in this country or this region. And that actually puts a huge burden on us. And so some of the geopolitics, as tensions rise in different countries, we're seeing new regulations that force us to not do business or not store certain data or not process certain things there. We see countries not want products from another country coming in. We're getting more pressure to use domestic services or domestic capabilities. And if you operate in one country or one region, that might be okay, but it is really hard as a global enterprise. I mean, if you have to get your firewalls from 10 different vendors in different regions of the world, that's a really big mess to manage. So we do have localized teams in some places. We have to adapt to the political realities, but those legal frameworks and things like that are the spillover geopolitics that actually are some of the bigger risks that we have to manage sometimes.
Wow, I mean, I'm just imagining the complexity of trying to manage things without that centralization component to it around your vendors as well. You know, I think one of the parts where there's also differences in terms of how people even process compute across different nations as well. You know, right now within Saudi, I mean, I don't even know all the different ways that people get compute beyond AWS, GCP, and Azure. But the fact is, you walk on the expo floor, and they are there. And so I think one of the things I'm really interested and focused on is how do you think about sort of the longevity of this problem, right? How do you plan out when you think about the threat actors, when you think about attribution, when you think about third parties? Like, what can you do now in getting ready for the complexity, and getting ready for all the things coming at you that you can't control as well? And for that, I'd love to start with you, Alex.
I very much feel like the long-term planning of that is simply that I know I will dedicate resources to it. But the more I can be adaptive and change to what my threats are, the faster, ideally I'm left of bang, but the closer I can be right of bang to that, the best position I'm in. So my strategy and the way that we deal with this risk on a global scale is to be as dialed in as possible, to act swiftly and directly when we see something new, a new behavior, a new threat. We don't sit on it. We don't sit around and wait. We don't say, oh, let's develop a 6-month plan. That immediately becomes priority 0. We do some level of immediate mitigation, some level of making sure we've got detection, some level of let's pull that thread and not just sit on it. Every time we've in my career that like we've gotten bit by something on a global scale, there was probably easy signs that we could have pulled on. There were threads we could have pulled to either disrupt the action early enough that it didn't have any impact, or to minimize the impact it ultimately did have. which is why I'm very allergic to the idea that we're going to like do some long-term 2-year, 18-month plan around it. Other than saying, hey, executives and board, I need resources. I'm not going to get into the weeds on what those resources are because we are going to tiger team and be tactical and be reactive to how the global dynamics shift.
You know, I love paralleling you with Priya, right? Because Priya has this risk perspective. She has this, consultative scale perspective as well. I mean, Priya, I'm curious, what do you think about it? How do you think about prepare or think about these long-term cyber incidents?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I would say that I don't completely disagree with everything you're saying, so we're aligned there. Again, different perspectives, right? I would say that for me, I do agree with Alex that I focus on today's problems, right? Because we don't even have a solution for today's problems. For example, I'm not thinking about PQC. I'm not thinking about getting quantum safe because it's not even a thing in our environment today. Right? And I know I have bigger fish to fry today, right? So I am very much like that as well, in terms of looking through today's problems. I'll kind of answer your question in using this framework, right? Again, going back to basics, first principles, people, process, technology. You want to make sure that your people have the foundational cyber security skill set and they have the risk savviness. In terms of understanding what are the looming threats out there, they understand how threat actors across the globe operate and work, right? Because if you put yourself in the shoes of how threat actors behave, then you're in a better position to defend. So that's the people aspect of it in terms of talent management and skills, and also making sure that you're managing burnout and fatigue, because cybersecurity is a time-consuming and a stressful job. So that is the people aspect of it. From a process standpoint, I will say it's really around scenario planning and building your playbooks, your resiliency playbooks, right? It's not a matter of if, but when. I think everyone in the room knows that. But when the moment of crisis strikes, how ready are you? How soon can you bounce back? So doing the scenario planning, preparing and testing your incident response plans through not only tabletop exercises, but also live drills, and making sure you're reflecting and acting on it in terms of making sure that you're prepared to be resilient. That's another factor as well. And add to that the backups and restoration testing, right? That's one of my key focus areas is, again, when the moment strikes, you kind of rely or hang your hat on how quickly are you able to restore your backups. But for that, you need to make sure you do your backups and test them on a periodic basis. So that's the process part. And then now in terms of the technology part, and I know you touched on this in terms of how we manage the vendor ecosystem and so on, there's a lot of tool sprawl, right, in the organization. We use multiple security tools, multiple firewalls, for example, firewalls from different vendors. So one of the real things I'm focusing on is to make sure that I'm adopting, there's a concept called there's a concept of best of breed and best of suite. Best of breed is typically, you're choosing the best vendor, the best product for a particular segment. For example, firewalls, for example. Best of suite is you're moving to one vendor ecosystem that provides it all, right? So it's better to integrate, it's easier to integrate, easier for your analysts to kind of, connect the dots and all of that. So that's something I'm keeping in mind from a technology perspective as well. So people, process, technology. I'm watching the clock here, sorry. That's all I had.
No, I appreciate it, Priya. Dependable as always, with the framework, right? Like, that's why I love consultants. I'm very framework driven as well. Well, I feel really bad because we have so many brilliant minds on this panel, and we really only got to hear one answer per person, per question, but we could have spent pretty much this entire time probably answering one question between these four brilliant minds. So I really appreciate everyone providing their perspective for the audience, and I'd love to ask the audience to give them a round of applause.